black sheep of the franchise, Valkyria Chronicles 2, is infamous for its moving the series from console to handheld and the drastic change in tone from the original game. It's quite common to see even diehard fans of the series tell newcomers to outright skip this game. So, does this game truly deserve its negative reputation? If you want a short answer, then I'll say an outright no. If you want a less simplistic answer and some reason for why I think that is the case, then stick around. I think the most glaring and obvious thing in this game is the aforementioned change in tone from the first game. In what seems like a desperate appeal to a wider Japanese audience, Valkyria Chronicles 2 has a very anime high school makeover, with all the character archetypes that come with that. In my opinion, it's not a horribly drastic change from the original game, since that had its fair share of nonsense too. But there is a greater quantity of that nonsense here. However, as a sequel, it doesn't feel disconnected from the original game, and various tonal and world elements have been passed on. For example, the idea of a military academy is not without context. In the previous game, it's mentioned about how the military has been connected with school environments, just as one example. Valkyria Chronicles 2 also follows through on some of the significant reveals made in the original game. The revelation of Cordelia's heritage has caused a civil war within Gallia, and the country is split in two. These rebels serve as the main antagonists of the game, which is quite dark compared to the original game's Imperials, considering that these would have been some of the same soldiers that fought for Gallia just 2 years earlier. This civil war concept falls in line with a lot of the disruption within countries following large-scale wars, as well as the foreign aid and input from larger powers hoping to gain influence over the potential new governments. This takes shape with the Federation being the one supplying aid to the rebels, which is following exactly how the Federation was characterized in the previous game, as a representation of dubious 20th century Western tactics. When I saw Maximilian's Valkyria suit for the first time in the original game, I truly wondered what would happen if this would eventually develop into some kind of new soldier in the years to come. And sure enough, said suit has reached mass production, which takes shape as some of the game's toughest enemies. Valkyria Chronicles 2 is closer tied to the historical tone and as a sequel to the previous game than people may understand, and I think that is something that should be acknowledged. But how is the main story specifically? Well, it feels quite polarized with what exactly they were trying to go for. High school antics, war trauma, ethics of military experiments, and depictions of Civil War politics all blended together in just about the worst way possible. It feels like they were trying to put in every idea they could think of, and they leave every idea underdeveloped. There is some legitimately interesting stuff in this game, mainly around the topic of the Civil War. When you see those glimmers of interesting ideas, it's exciting for that split second, but it never lasts long. With a very unique setting and those glimmers, it's enough to get you through the story, but just barely. Although it's hard to talk about the story without bringing up the main cast, since the game is relatively character focused. Right here is probably the weakest non-gameplay element of the game: the main characters. I'll get to main character Ivan in a second, but I want to talk about his sidekicks, Zeri and Cosette. These two are pretty much irredeemable, as they're just completely boring. Zeri is a complainer whose only saving grace is that he has a good voice actor, and Cosette is just completely void of personality. They try to characterize her with a traumatic past, but it's just done so poorly with an already uninteresting character, so you feel absolutely nothing. Get used to these two because they'll be with you the entire game, doing their best to out-boring each other. Ivan is an interesting one. He's meant to be like the bumbling hothead with radical ideas, but during the game it feels a little different to that. He has no kind of stable character throughout the game, and his personality will change depending on what the scene needs. There are some fairly infamous scenes of stupidity, but at the same time there are some legitimately nice moments with other characters. It can feel like he's written by a few different writers, and he says whatever the writer feels is good for the current situation, which is some fairly lazy writing. His personal story is, spoilers, cover your ears and eyes for a few seconds, that his brother is essentially Darth Vader, and that makes him sad. If you think that sounds dumb, that's because it is, and it might be the most unoriginal and terrible thing in this game. Okay, so the main cast is bad, but how does the rest of the squad come across? There's a fairly big difference in how your squad has been treated in this game. They feel cut more from specific and frankly tiresome archetypical character roles, and overall feel less original and real. Although on the other hand, they also feel a lot more memorable than some of the characters in the original game. Some can be memorable for the wrong reasons and are completely absurd. The artist, the wannabe rock star, the butler, the nun? I think these examples are what a lot of the people see wrong with Valkyria Chronicles 2, but they're not representative of the entire cast. Helmut, Sigrid, Lavinia, and my personal favourite, Alexis, are quite interesting characters, more so than the squad mates from the original game. There are missions and cutscenes specifically dedicated to fleshing out characters, so I think you'll find that you'll warm to the entire squad more than you'd expect to. These character missions, I would say, are one of my favourite additions to the game, just because it's refreshing to give characters outside the main cast their own moments. There are a lot of significant gameplay changes in Valkyria Chronicles 2, some of them being some much needed balancing and improvements, but some of them are pretty questionable and even frustrating. Orders have been completely nerfed and now cost significantly more CP to use, and because of this, you actually really rarely use them, which has got to be one of the most radical differences from the first. A core element to this game is customization, and there is a massive amount of different variations of weapons, not to mention that you have a huge selection of vehicles and parts for said vehicles to choose from. Vehicles can really be tailored to your playstyle, and you won't game over if they're destroyed, so you can be a lot more daring with how you use them. In regards to your squad, it features a smaller cast of 34, down from 43 in the previous game, and no permadeath. The reduced cast isn't as bad, since there aren't any poor performing characters like there were in the first game, so it does kind of average out. No permadeath though makes you fairly lazy in terms of trying to save soldiers, since you don't lose anyone by not saving them. Most likely, in order to incorporate the hardware capabilities of the PSP, the levels have been cut up into small sections rather than one large map. Now this sounds horrible on paper, but it works surprisingly well. In the first game, there were many camps that were honestly pointless to control, but in Valkyria Chronicles 2, camps are now used as a means of connecting the map sections together, making them necessary to capture in order to achieve the goal. Not only that, but due to the density of which camps are located on these small maps, they come under threat more often, and there is an increased importance on defending them. Although the game is still offensively oriented like its predecessor, you have to incorporate a few defensive tactics into your playstyle. Does that mean that these small map sections are better than the large sprawling ones of the original? Not necessarily. It's more like a band-aid on the gameplay and balancing issues of the first game rather than a direct improvement. Now, not only does Valkyria Chronicles 2 have brand new classes, but also a branching class tree. When upgraded to their maximum rank, you can field some very specialized units. This is actually a change that I like a lot, since I believe fielding armies of complementary strengths and weaknesses is more interesting and requires more strategy than just generalized units who can handle every situation. So, how successful is this branching class tree? Ooh, tough question. It's actually such a tough question that I had to make an entirely separate video just breaking down all the classes and how they work. So if you want to hear more about what I consider the most interesting part of this game, go check that video out. A lack of difficulty was a big issue with the first game, and it's something that really hasn't been fixed here. Honestly, this game is actually quite a bit easier, even with all the balance issues that the first had. There's a few suspicions I have of why this might be the case. Valkyria Chronicles 2 has this damage system where, depending on the angle that you are hit, it changes how much damage is dealt. Basically, the front defense of your units is just way too high, and there are a few times where the enemy has a chance to attack you from the rear or sides. Another reason could be because of how obtuse the leveling system is. I feel like they may have designed the game around baseline, unupgraded classes, just in case someone never achieved enough credits to upgrade them. Which is actually a situation I could see happening since credits can be so hard to come by. I also think they lessened the difficulty in order to potentially widen the audience for the game, and they were afraid of turning anyone away with a challenge. There are times where challenge rears its head, and you can definitely see how interesting the game's mechanics could be, but those missions are actually extremely rare. While the game itself is enjoyable to play, it can almost feel like you're coasting through it and the fun can dull as the game goes on. Speaking of credits, we are on the topic of, in my opinion, the most annoying and frustrating part of this game. Basically, there is class XP like there is in the previous game, but also a new leveling system which is used to upgrade individuals' class that has an entirely separate system based around credits. Missions have this very frustrating mechanic of absolutely randomly dealing out these things called credits, which you basically earn by playing as a specific character. Missions give out a list of certain credits, but what credits and who gets them is totally random, which is extremely frustrating if you're wanting to upgrade a unit. Even if you use a character you want to upgrade for 90% of the mission, they could walk away with absolutely nothing of value. This game wants you to grind to upgrade your characters, but it's a system where you could grind for literal hours and end up with absolutely nothing to show for it. Do you need these upgrades though? Not really. For me, I was trying to level up characters so I could show them off for the review, but they're never really critical to the game. But at the same time, it's just flat out annoying that something as fun and as exciting as new classes are locked behind a system that is almost like a slot machine. Music in this game is as decent as it was in the previous game. There's no dip in quality, but there's no increase in quality either. In fact, there is a lot of reused music from the previous game, or at least music that sounds very similar. Voice acting is for the most part similar in quality to the first game. Jason Spisak, who voices Ivan, is actually a decent voice actor in my opinion, and all the annoying lines he says are due to writing problems and not really acting problems. When it comes to Cosette, I'm not sure if Janice Kawaya is to blame or if it's just awful writing. In my opinion, it's a bit of both. Sorry, Janice. Zeri is voiced by Crispin Freeman. Oh, Crispin Freeman, what are you doing here? You're too good for this nonsense. Only the finest quality hams have been used in the creation of this game, with Liam O'Brien voicing main villain Baldrin. Joking aside, I actually really like Liam O'Brien a lot, and he's always someone who puts in 110% into the characters he plays. And he saves what might have been an uninteresting character with his amazing ham abilities. When it comes to how your squad voices are, it's pretty spotty, just like in the original game. I will say it feels a little more leveled out with less bad performances, but also less good ones. So ultimately, what is the root cause for weakness in this game? In my opinion, it's because they were trying to transfer a console game to a portable release. It's not the fact that it's on a handheld system that's the problem. It's that they've gone out of their way to treat it like a handheld release. You have to grind missions for resources to buy weapons, and you have to grind missions to get credits, and there isn't any resistance and difficulty to impede you grinding. To really get the most out of this game, you have to put in some serious time. This is my second time playing the game, and on my first time playing it, I put in something like 150 hours, just getting everything and doing all the post-game content. If you just want to play through it just as a straight story, then it might seem a little more uninteresting, and if you want to experience everything the game has to offer, then you have to sink in every bit of spare time that you have. It's nice that there's lots of content, but at the same time it can feel a little all or nothing, and I don't have the same time I once had 5 years ago to put in another 150 hours into this game. So it's confirmed that Valkyria Chronicles 2 is an extremely terrible game that you should never play because it's so awful. No, that's absolutely not the case. This game is not as bad as people say, and I feel as if people criticize it for the wrong reasons, and don't acknowledge all the legitimately good things about it, of which are not in the minority. For the most part, it's a couple but big elements that spoil what is actually a pretty decent game. Gameplay wise, it still has that core Valkyria Chronicles gameplay with a lot of fun improvements. Story and design wise, it can lean a little more on the silly side, but not significantly more so than the first game, and I don't think people realize just how similar in tone both games actually are. It's overall a fun and enjoyable game that feels unique, and I think anyone who says otherwise is selling a good game short.